The galaxy had never seen a threat like the Zha'thar. A brutal and ancient alien race, they had come out of the dark void of space with a single mission: to conquer and destroy everything in their path. No one knew where they came from, or how long they had been watching humanity, but what was clear was that they were here, and they weren't leaving until every human was either dead or enslaved. The first signs of the invasion were subtle, small fleets appearing near the edges of human space, raiding distant colonies, taking out communication relays, and cutting off trade routes. But it didn't take long before the full force of the Zha'thar fleet arrived. They were massive, their ships unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. Designed for war, their sleek obsidian-colored vessels glided through space with terrifying speed, their weapons capable of obliterating entire fleets in a single strike. The first battle occurred at the outskirts of the Mars system, where the human defense fleet was stationed. The Zha'thar didn't even give them a chance. They arrived in a flash of burning light, and before the humans could even react, their fleet was destroyed, every ship lost, every soldier dead. The message was clear. Humanity was no match for them. In the aftermath, entire star systems fell one by one. The Zha'thar advanced without hesitation, sweeping across the stars like a storm. There was no mercy, no negotiation. They did not care for diplomacy or treaties. They only wanted to wipe out every last human, leaving nothing but a graveyard in their wake. People in the affected systems didn't even have time to escape. Cities burned. Planets fell silent. Governments crumbled. Even the brightest minds of humanity, those who had once designed advanced weaponry and systems, were left powerless against the might of the invaders. However, the Zha'thar weren't just merciless conquerors. They were also deeply arrogant. They believed that no race, no species, could ever challenge their dominance. In their eyes, humanity was little more than a nuisance, a temporary obstacle on their path to galactic rule. And so, they did not bother to destroy the last of the human resistance all at once. Instead, they toyed with it, leaving human fleets scattered and broken, slowly watching them die out. They let the fear of the inevitable extinction spread across human space, knowing that the human spirit would eventually break. But the Zha'thar had made one fatal mistake: they underestimated the humans. On the last surviving human fleet, the USS Ascendant, Captain Lyra Donovan refused to let the Zha'thar win. She knew the odds. She understood that a fleet of such power was almost impossible to defeat. But she also knew something the invaders did not. Humans would never give up without a fight. The Ascendant, a small and unremarkable warship compared to the Zha'thar's colossal dreadnoughts, had survived an entire month behind enemy lines. How? Because it didn't fight like a machine. It fought like a human. Captain Donovan and her crew, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with the passion and ingenuity of their people. They used their knowledge of their own space and their ability to think quickly, adapt, and surprise. The crew of the USS Ascendant had seen the horrors of war up close. Many of them had lost family. Some had lost entire colonies. But they hadn't lost hope, not yet. And that made them dangerous. They had no illusions of easy victory. They knew that each battle was one of survival, that every step forward might be their last. But as long as they had a chance, they would keep fighting. And that, above all, was what made the Zha'thar nervous. The Zha'thar's General Vrax watched the human resistance with a mixture of confusion and amusement. He saw them as weak, their will to survive just a temporary annoyance. He had never faced an enemy like this before, one that refused to simply lie down and die. He believed that soon the humans would break. Soon they would surrender. Soon their will would shatter under the weight of his forces. But each victory he won, each world he destroyed, made him realize something unsettling. Humanity wasn't surrendering. They were fighting back in ways he couldn't predict. One fateful day, as General Vrax prepared to wipe out another human colony, something unexpected happened. The USS Ascendant, using a new and risky tactic, managed to slip past a Zha'thar blockade and launch a surprise attack on one of their supply ships. The attack was nothing special, just a small human warship attacking a much larger target. Yet the Zha'thar had never seen anything like it before. They were used to enemies who cowered in fear, not ones who dared to fight back with such cunning. It was a small victory, but it had an enormous effect. The humans had done the impossible. They had damaged a key supply ship and temporarily halted the Zha'thar's momentum. The Zha'thar could not ignore this. General Vrax ordered a full-scale retaliation, sending ships to hunt down the Ascendant and its crew. But it wasn't enough. Even though the human fleet was outnumbered and outmatched, the battle strategies of the U.S.S. Ascendant were not ones that the Zha'thar could easily predict. The humans were fast, resourceful, and unpredictable, and these qualities were beginning to work in their favor. As the Zha'thar pressed their attack, Captain Lyra Donovan called her crew to the front lines once more, each of them knowing that the stakes were higher than ever. This was no longer just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the future of humanity. But as they prepared for their most dangerous mission yet, no one could have predicted the horror that awaited them. Because while the humans were starting to gain ground, the Zha'thar were hiding a secret, a weapon so powerful that it could turn the tide of the war in an instant. In a final act of desperation, the Zha'thar unleashed their most devastating weapon, capable of wiping out entire star systems. With a single strike, the battle would become a test of humanity's resilience. Could the U.S.S. Ascendant, a single human ship, stand against this overwhelming force? Could they defy the impossible once again? The fate of the human race hung in the balance, and the galaxy watched with bated breath as the final confrontation began. The terrifying invasion had begun. But the question was, who would survive? Who would stand tall in the face of such overwhelming odds? Only one thing was certain: humanity was far from defeated. The U.S.S. Ascendant sailed quietly through the dark expanse of space, its crew on high alert, knowing that they had crossed into the heart of Zha'thar territory. The ship, small and unassuming, was a symbol of humanity's refusal to surrender. Captain Lyra Donovan stood at the helm, her eyes scanning the distant stars. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, human forces had been scattered across the galaxy, scrambling to mount a defense against an invincible enemy. Now, only the Ascendant stood between humanity's last hope and the ruthless alien invaders. Lyra's crew, though battle-hardened and determined, couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. Their mission was simple: find a way to disrupt the Zha'thar supply lines, cutting off their ability to reinforce their fleets. But it was a task that seemed impossible. The Zha'thar controlled everything now, and their fleets stretched across the galaxy, their ships towering over anything the humans could muster. As the Ascendant moved deeper into enemy space, the silence around them grew unbearable. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound breaking the stillness. Then, without warning, a blinding flash lit up the darkness ahead. The ship's sensors screamed a warning: enemy fleet detected. It was too late to retreat. The Zha'thar had found them. The enemy ships appeared like shadows from the depths of space, their sleek black forms emerging from the void with terrifying precision. They were enormous, massive warships designed for nothing but destruction. Captain Lyra's stomach churned as she saw the scale of the Zha'thar fleet. There were at least 50 ships, each one far more powerful than anything humanity had ever created. These were not the small skirmish vessels the humans had faced before. This was the full might of the Zha'thar military. Their ships moved in tight formations, like a swarm of deadly insects ready to devour anything in their path. "Get ready for battle," Captain Lyra ordered, her voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. She had trained for this moment, but nothing could prepare her for the terror of facing a fleet that could wipe out humanity in one stroke. Her crew rushed into action, taking their positions at stations across the ship. Each person knew the stakes failure wasn't an option. The first exchange of fire came faster than anyone could have anticipated. The Ascendant's weapons fired first, sending a volley of energy blasts toward the Zha'thar ships. But the blasts barely made a dent. The Zha'thar ships retaliated immediately, launching a barrage of plasma missiles that tore through the void toward the Ascendant. The human ship twisted and turned, weaving through the deadly missiles, narrowly avoiding each strike. The crew braced themselves as the ship rocked from a near miss. The bridge trembled under the impact of another explosion. Lyra's heart raced. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and yet the crew refused to give up. "We can't take many more of these hits," the ship's chief engineer, Marcus, shouted over the intercom. "Hull integrity is starting to fail." Captain Lyra's mind raced. She couldn't afford to panic, not now. She knew she had only one option: to get inside the Zha'thar formation and strike fast. "Steady, everyone. We're not running. We're going in." With one sharp command, the Ascendant veered toward the heart of the Zha'thar fleet, flying straight into the storm of plasma fire. The Zha'thar ships were so massive, they didn't expect the Ascendant to dare such a reckless move. It was a human trait, one that no alien race had been able to predict. They relied on speed, maneuverability, and surprise. Lyra's fingers danced across the controls as she steered the ship, the hum of the engines in perfect sync with the beat of her own heart. The Ascendant weaved between enemy ships, firing its weapons with deadly precision. The crew worked like a well-oiled machine, each person performing their role flawlessly. The shields flickered and sparked as they absorbed yet another barrage, but they held just barely. The ship's weapons pounded Zha'thar ships, causing minor damage. But it was enough to gain the attention of the enemy commander. General Vrax, the leader of the Zha'thar forces, watched the humans with a mixture of confusion and growing irritation. This was no ordinary resistance. These humans were persistent. These humans were unpredictable. Vrax's ships closed in, forming a tighter formation. But Captain Lyra was already thinking 2 steps ahead. She had no intention of being caught in a trap. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," she ordered. With a flick of a switch, the Ascendant dove beneath the massive ships, threading its way between the larger Zha'thar vessels. The Zha'thar fleet, too focused on destroying the human ship, failed to realize the deadly trap they were setting for themselves. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos. "Now! Fire everything!" The Ascendant unleashed every weapon it had in a concentrated blast, hitting one of the larger Zha'thar ships dead center. The explosion was massive. The ship broke apart, its massive frame disintegrating into pieces of debris. For a moment, there was stunned silence, as both the human crew and the Zha'thar looked on in disbelief. The Ascendant had just destroyed a ship many times its size. It was a symbol of defiance, a message to the invaders that humanity was far from defeated. But the Zha'thar didn't retreat. Instead, they redoubled their efforts. More plasma missiles rained down on the Ascendant, and the enemy ships moved in for the kill. Captain Lyra's eyes were fixed on the enemy formations. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to survive. "We can't keep this up much longer," Marcus said, his voice strained. "If we don't get out of here, we're finished." Lyra gritted her teeth. "Hold on. We're not done yet." In a last-ditch effort, she ordered the Ascendant to break through the enemy lines. The ship shot forward at full speed, using its small size and agility to avoid the oncoming attacks. For a split second, it felt like the Ascendant might actually make it through the Zha'thar lines. But then, a massive blast rocked the ship, sending it spinning out of control. The crew's voices echoed in the comms, filled with panic and urgency. Lyra fought the controls, struggling to steady the ship. The Zha'thar ships closed in, their firepower overwhelming. Just as all hope seemed lost, a miracle happened. A second human fleet, having tracked the Ascendant's movements, arrived in the nick of time, flanking the Zha'thar ships from behind. A fierce battle erupted as the 2 fleets clashed in the void. The Zha'thar were caught off guard, and for the first time, the Ascendant's crew saw the Zha'thar forces falter. But Captain Lyra knew this was just the beginning. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The Zha'thar had underestimated humanity, and that would be their greatest mistake. With the enemy ships retreating for the moment, the Ascendant limped back to a safe distance. The crew was battered, exhausted, but alive. The first encounter had been a brutal one, but the humans had shown something the Zha'thar hadn't counted on. They weren't just fighting to survive, they were fighting to win. And in that moment, the galaxy began to realize that humanity was a force to be reckoned with. The SS. Ascendant drifted silently through the darkness of space, now in the very heart of the Zha'thar Empire. The crew had barely survived their first encounter, and Captain Lyra Donovan knew they were playing a dangerous game. The stakes had risen. They weren't just fighting to stay alive anymore. They were fighting to strike at the core of the Zha'thar's power. If they succeeded, they might be able to cripple the invaders and give humanity a fighting chance. But if they failed, it would mean the end of everything. Lyra stood at the bridge, her gaze fixed on the vast expanse of stars ahead. Her heart raced with a mixture of dread and determination. The Zha'thar had been relentless in their conquest of human space, crushing every resistance they met with overwhelming force. But this was something different. Deep inside Zha'thar space, there was an ancient weapon, a weapon that could tip the balance in humanity's favor. It was said to be hidden in the heart of their most powerful station, a place where no one had ever dared to go and live. The Zha'thar had guarded it fiercely, keeping it shrouded in secrecy. And now, it was humanity's only hope. "Captain," came the voice of Lieutenant Reese, the ship's communications officer. "We're approaching the station." "We should prepare for" before he could finish. A loud alarm blared throughout the ship, signaling a massive fleet of Zha'thar ships on an intercept course. It was too late to retreat. The Ascendant was already too deep within their territory. The Zha'thar had found them. "Brace yourselves," Lyra shouted, gripping the edge of her command chair as the Ascendant's engines flared to life. The ship's shields shimmered as a wave of plasma fire slammed into them. The ship rocked violently, but the shields held for now. The Zha'thar fleet emerged from the darkness, enormous ships flanked by smaller, faster vessels. They surrounded the Ascendant, cutting off any possible escape route. It was a trap, and Lyra knew it, but she had no choice. They had come this far. They could not afford to lose the only chance they had. "Fire back!" "Full power to the weapons," Lyra ordered, her voice calm but filled with urgency. The Ascendant's cannons roared to life, sending blasts of energy toward the Zha'thar ships. But it was a futile effort. Their weapons were barely making a dent. The enemy ships retaliated with brutal force, launching waves of missiles that struck the Ascendant with devastating power. The ship shuddered, and alarms blared as the hull groaned under the strain. The crew scrambled to respond, each person doing their best to keep the ship from falling apart. "We need to get out of here," shouted Marcus, the chief engineer. "We can't hold much longer against this kind of firepower." Lyra's eyes darted around the bridge. Escape was impossible. There were too many ships, and they were too close. But they couldn't give up. They couldn't let this be the end. "Set a course for the station." "Now," she ordered, making a quick decision. The crew didn't hesitate. The Ascendant veered off, heading straight for the massive Zha'thar station ahead. It was their only shot. If they could get to the station, they might find a way to disable the Zha'thar's weapon or sabotage their operations. If not, the Ascendant would be lost, and humanity's last hope would vanish in the blink of an eye. The Zha'thar ships followed, relentless in their pursuit, firing everything they had at the Ascendant. The human ship twisted and turned, evading the incoming blasts by mere inches, but it was clear that the battle was not in their favor. The Ascendant's hull was starting to show signs of severe damage, and the shields were flickering dangerously. "We're going to make it," Lyra muttered under her breath, though she wasn't sure if she truly believed it. There was no other option. They had to succeed. The future of humanity rested on this single, desperate mission. As the Ascendant neared the station, a sense of eerie calm settled over the crew. The station was massive, far larger than any human ship. It was a sprawling, ominous structure that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Towering spires stretched up from its surface, and large docking bays loomed like open jaws, waiting to swallow anything that dared to enter. It was the heart of the Zha'thar Empire, and the crew of the Ascendant had to breach it if they were to stand a chance. "We're close," said Reese, his eyes fixed on the station ahead. "The docking bay is opening. We need to get inside now, or we won't survive." Lyra nodded. "Prepare for boarding. Everyone, get ready." The ship's engines roared as they closed the final distance to the station. The Zha'thar fleet was still hot on their tail, but the Ascendant had no choice but to press forward. The docking bay was opening, and the Ascendant made a final dash toward it. The Ascendant entered the station's docking bay with only seconds to spare before a massive barrage from the Zha'thar fleet tore into the empty space where the ship had just been. The human ship barely made it inside the bay, and as the doors slammed shut behind them, the crew was met with an unsettling silence. "Now we move fast," Lyra said, her voice hard and determined. "We have no idea what we're up against inside, but we'll find that weapon and destroy it. We're not leaving here without it." The crew quickly geared up, ready to face whatever dangers the station might hold. They moved as one, their steps heavy with the weight of what they had to do. The Zha'thar would not make this easy. They would fight to the last to protect their weapon, but the humans knew they had no choice. There was no turning back. As they entered the vast corridors of the station, the crew was struck by the sheer size of the place. It was a maze of dark hallways and towering rooms, lit only by dim, flickering lights. Every step they took seemed to echo, as if the station itself was alive and watching them. The air was thick with tension. Every corner, every shadow could hide a Zha'thar soldier or a deadly trap. "We need to stick together," Lyra whispered to her crew, her voice barely audible in the heavy silence. "We don't know what's ahead, but we're in this together. We've made it this far, and we'll make it the rest of the way." They pressed forward, moving cautiously but quickly. The Zha'thar had no intention of letting them reach their target. As they navigated the labyrinthine station, the crew encountered resistance, armed Zha'thar soldiers, automated defense systems, and traps designed to kill anyone who dared trespass. But the humans fought with everything they had, their resolve hardening with every challenge. As they neared the heart of the station, the crew could feel the air growing colder, the atmosphere heavier. It was as if they were approaching something far darker than they had imagined, something ancient and terrifying. The weapon they were searching for was close, but so was the danger. And as they rounded a corner, they finally saw it, a massive chamber, filled with a strange, pulsating energy. It was a weapon like nothing they had ever seen before, one that could change the fate of the entire war. But reaching it would not be easy. The crew of the HFY Ascendant had come to the heart of the Zha'thar Empire. They had found what they were looking for. But the real battle was just beginning. The crew of the HFY Ascendant was battered, bruised, and running on empty. They had made it through the heart of the Zha'thar Empire, infiltrated the dark labyrinthine station, and now stood before the weapon that could change everything. But the tension in the air was palpable. They had been fighting on the edge of disaster for so long that none of them knew if they could keep going. Yet, they had no choice. The stakes were too high. If they didn't destroy the weapon in front of them, humanity's final hope would be crushed by the unrelenting might of the Zha'thar. Captain Lyra Donovan stood in the cold, dimly lit chamber, her breath shallow, her mind racing. Her crew was spread out, their weapons drawn, eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. They had reached the heart of the station, a vast, mechanical room filled with pulsing lights and ominous machinery. In the center of the room stood the weapon, an enormous alien device humming with a dark, powerful energy. Its shape was unlike anything humanity had ever seen, a twisted fusion of metal and organic matter that seemed to pulse as if alive. Lyra's heart skipped a beat as she realized just how close they were to the Zha'thar's greatest weapon, the one that could obliterate entire fleets in a single strike. "Everyone stay sharp," Lyra ordered, her voice steady despite the dread that gripped her chest. "This is it. We've come too far to fail now." Her team nodded, their expressions hard with determination. The Zha'thar would stop at nothing to protect their weapon. Lyra knew they had to act quickly. But even as they moved toward the device, the quiet hum of the station was broken by the sudden, violent screech of alarms. Red lights began to flash, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the chamber. They were not alone. The doors to the chamber slammed shut with a resounding crash, locking the crew inside. Lyra turned toward the entrance just in time to see a group of Zha'thar soldiers, heavily armored and armed with energy rifles, emerge from the shadows. The soldiers were unlike any the crew had faced before, larger, faster, and deadlier. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, a sign of the advanced genetic modifications the Zha'thar had perfected over the years. These were the elite, the very best of the Zha'thar military. Fire! Lyra shouted, and the crew opened fire, their weapons flashing in the dim light. The first wave of Zha'thar soldiers staggered under the barrage of fire, but their heavy armor absorbed most of the shots. They moved with terrifying speed, charging forward in a coordinated assault. The crew of the Ascendant held their ground, but they were outnumbered, and every shot they fired seemed to do little to slow the Zha'thar advance. "Keep them back!" Marcus, the chief engineer, shouted as he worked furiously at the control panel on the side of the chamber. "I'm trying to disable the weapon, but it's locked down tight." Lyra's mind raced. They couldn't afford to be overwhelmed. She turned to her communications officer, Reese. "Send a distress signal to the fleet. We need backup, now." Reese nodded and quickly began typing into the console. But before he could finish, a loud explosion rocked the chamber, and the room's lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The only illumination now came from the faint glow of the weapon in the center of the room. The Zha'thar soldiers used the confusion to their advantage, charging forward with brutal efficiency. Lyra felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. They were on the verge of victory, but it was slipping through their fingers. The Ascendant's crew was fighting with everything they had, but they were being pushed back. The Zha'thar were relentless, and the tide of battle was turning. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Lyra saw something that gave her a glimmer of hope. A small, flickering light on the far side of the chamber, one of the control panels. It was unguarded. If she could get to it, maybe there was a chance to disable the weapon manually. But it was a risk. The Zha'thar soldiers were closing in, and it would take all of her skill and speed to reach it before they overwhelmed the crew. "Cover me!" Lyra shouted, and without waiting for a response, she sprinted across the room, dodging blasts of energy fire and weaving through the chaos. Her heart pounded in her chest, each second feeling like an eternity. She could hear the heavy footfalls of the Zha'thar soldiers behind her, but she didn't dare look back. If she failed, everything would be lost. She reached the control panel and slammed her hand onto the console, desperately trying to make sense of the alien controls. The machine was far more advanced than anything humans had encountered, but Lyra had studied every piece of intel she could get her hands on. She wasn't about to give up now. With a flick of her wrist, she managed to access a hidden system override. She could hear the sound of the weapon powering down, the hum of the machinery starting to slow. But just as she thought she had won, a deafening roar shook the chamber. The Zha'thar soldiers had arrived. They surrounded her, their glowing eyes locked onto her position. The weapon was nearly disabled, but she was trapped. The crew fought valiantly to cover her, but the odds were against them. They couldn't hold the line forever. Lyra's thoughts raced. The Zha'thar would kill her, and then they would take control of the weapon again. There had to be another way. And then, just as the Zha'thar soldiers closed in, she heard it distant, but growing louder, the unmistakable sound of an incoming fleet. Her heart leapt in her chest. "Backup is here," Reese shouted over the comms. The battle outside had reached a fever pitch. The Zha'thar fleet had arrived, but it wasn't just any fleet. It was humanity's fleet arriving just in time to turn the tide. The Ascendant's distress signal had been received, and reinforcements had arrived to deliver a devastating blow to the Zha'thar. The Zha'thar soldiers hesitated, their eyes flickering in panic as they realized the battle was no longer in their favor. Lyra didn't wait for them to regroup. She hit the final command, and the weapon in the center of the room powered down with a groaning whine. The Zha'thar's greatest advantage was gone. But the war wasn't over yet. As the first human ships breached the station's atmosphere, the Zha'thar turned their focus to them. Lyra knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war, but the tides had finally turned. Humanity had fought back. They had held their ground when all seemed lost, and now they were poised to win. "We've done it," Marcus said, his voice filled with disbelief. Lyra nodded, her eyes hardening with determination. "This is just the beginning. We've taken the first step, but there's more to be done." The Zha'thar may have underestimated us, but they won't make that mistake again. We'll finish what we started. Together, the crew of the USS Ascendant stood victorious, bloodied, battered, but not broken. The tides had turned, and humanity's fight for survival had only just begun. The USS Ascendant drifted in the quiet aftermath of battle, its damaged hull still holding strong as the crew stood together on the bridge. Captain Lyra Donovan stood at the front, her eyes fixed on the vast expanse of space ahead, now dotted with the debris of destroyed Zha'thar ships. The battle had been long, brutal, and costly. The weapon the Zha'thar had protected so fiercely was gone, its power neutralized. But this victory, as significant as it was, felt like only a small victory in a much larger, ongoing war. Humanity had pushed back the Zha'thar, but Lyra knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Captain Reese, the communications officer, called out, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "We're receiving a transmission from the Alliance fleet. They've taken control of the outer Zha'thar systems. They want to speak with you." Lyra took a deep breath and nodded. The tide had turned, but the war was far from over. She couldn't afford to relax. Not now. Not yet. "Put them through," she ordered. The image on the screen flickered, and then Admiral Owens, the leader of the human fleet, appeared. His face was worn and tired, but there was a spark of something in his eyes. Hope, maybe. Relief. It was something Lyra hadn't seen in a long time. "Captain Donovan," Admiral Owens said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "We've turned the corner. The Zha'thar are retreating, and their empire is crumbling." Lyra's chest tightened as the weight of the victory settled in. But she couldn't celebrate just yet. What about the rest of their forces? Are they going to regroup? Admiral Owens nodded slowly. "Yes, they will. But we've given them a blow they can't recover from. Our fleets are pushing forward, and with the weapon you destroyed, we've broken their technological advantage. This is our chance to finish this." Lyra's mind raced as the enormity of what lay ahead began to sink in. The Zha'thar might retreat for now, but they were not going to disappear quietly. They were a powerful, brutal race, and they would not go down without a fight. But for the first time in years, Lyra felt a glimmer of hope. The human race wasn't just surviving anymore. They were fighting back. "Understood, Admiral." "We're ready to move out," Lyra said, her voice firm with determination. "We'll meet you at the rendezvous point." After the call ended, Lyra turned to her crew. Their faces were just as exhausted as hers, but there was something different now. They had been through hell, faced impossible odds, and still stood strong. They had done what no one thought possible. And now, they had the chance to finish what they'd started. "Everyone," Lyra said, her voice calm but filled with resolve, "this is just the beginning. We've taken down their greatest weapon, but we still have a war to win. We don't stop until the Zha'thar are no longer a threat. We push forward, together. Every step we take, we're one step closer to ending this war." The crew nodded, the energy in the room shifting from exhaustion to determination. There was no turning back now. They had come too far, and they weren't going to stop until the job was done. As the USS Ascendant turned away from the wreckage of the Zha'thar station, Lyra looked out at the stars ahead. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't seem so bleak. The darkness of the Zha'thar threat was still there, but now humanity had the strength to push it back. Hours later, the Ascendant reached the rendezvous point, where the human fleet had already begun to regroup. Ships of all sizes were gathered, and their crews were hard at work, preparing for the next phase of the fight. The war was far from over, but the tides had shifted. The Zha'thar had been dealt a blow they hadn't expected. And humanity? Humanity had proven that they would not bow down. Lyra stood on the bridge, her gaze fixed on the fleet. Her mind was focused, sharp. It was time to plan the next strike. The Zha'thar had underestimated them. They thought they could crush humanity without even trying. But now, the tables had turned. Humanity had found a way to fight back. They had discovered a strength they didn't even know they had, and it was growing stronger by the day. "I'll take command of the next operation," Lyra said, her voice calm but resolute. "We push forward, and we don't stop until we've taken the Zha'thar down for good. We've got one shot at this, and we will not fail." The crew rallied behind her words, their confidence renewed. The war wasn't over, but they were no longer the underdogs. They had shown the universe that humanity could fight, and fight they would. The next few days were filled with planning, organizing, and gathering intelligence. Every corner of the human fleet was buzzing with activity as the war effort ramped up. There was no room for hesitation. Every resource, every ship, every soldier was needed. The Zha'thar might have thought they could crush humanity like they had crushed so many others, but they were wrong. This time, the humans were fighting back with everything they had. And then the day came. The attack. The final assault on the heart of the Zha'thar Empire. Lyra stood at the helm of the Ascendant, her crew at their stations, their faces filled with fierce determination. This was it. The culmination of everything they had worked for. The end of a war that had dragged on for too long. They moved into Zha'thar space, the fleet of human ships cutting through the dark void like a knife through cloth. The Zha'thar fleet was waiting, but now humanity had the advantage. The tide had turned, and the Zha'thar had no idea what was about to hit them. Lyra's voice came over the comms, steady and strong. "This is it, everyone. Today we fight not just for our survival, but for the future of our people. Today we end this war. For Earth. For humanity." With that, the battle began. A wave of firepower surged across the battlefield, ships clashing in a deafening roar of explosions and energy blasts. The Zha'thar fought back with all their might, but they were no match for the combined strength of the human fleet. Humanity had learned from their past mistakes, adapted, and now they were unstoppable. As the battle raged on, Lyra couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The dawn of a new era. The beginning of